You're standing in line. But this isn't for coffee or a concert ticket. This is a queue at 26,000 feet on K2, the savage mountain. Every second you wait, your oxygen drains, your body shuts down, and ahead of you, someone just stopped moving. This is the story of climbers who paid the ultimate price on the world's deadliest mountain. Let's dive in. If you don't know K2, let me tell you, this mountain makes Everest look friendly. Sure, Everest is taller, but K2 is the killer, the second highest peak on Earth, sitting at 28,251 feet on the Pakistan-China border. And the statistics don't lie. Everest kills roughly 6.5 climbers per 100 successful summits. K2, 14 deaths per 100 summits, more than double. Why? Unpredictable weather that can turn deadly in minutes, constant rockfall that rains down without warning, climbing sections so technical that one mistake means death, and the bottleneck, a section so notorious it has its own body count. Only about 700 people have ever reached K2's summit. Compare that to Everest's thousands. And K2 has claimed 96 lives, 96 people who dreamed of standing on top of the world's second highest peak and never came home. There's an unspoken rule in extreme mountaineering that becomes brutally clear on K2. You only save yourself. When someone falls, when someone collapses, when someone starts dying in the death zone, you keep moving. Because stopping to help often means two bodies instead of one. Let's talk money for a second, because climbing K2 isn't just dangerous, it's expensive. A standard expedition package costs around $35,000. That gets you high-altitude food, fuel, tents, and 3 bottles of supplemental oxygen. Plus 1 or 2 bottles for your Sherpa guide who'll help haul your equipment. Want better odds of survival? Premium packages run upward of $50,000. That buys you 10 oxygen bottles and 2 Sherpas. But here's the thing. Those prices don't include gear. You still need a specialized thermal suit, gloves, GPS tracker, crampons, goggles, and 2-way radios. That's another $5,000 to $10,000 depending on quality. So you're looking at $40,000 to $60,000 total. Minimum. And none of that money guarantees you come home alive. If you die near the summit, your body stays there, forever, frozen in place. A rescue operation is too dangerous. Body recovery missions often kill more people. In the ice-cold wilderness of K2, survival of the fittest isn't just a saying, it's the law. And that brings us to Mohammed Hassan, a porter whose death on July 27, 2023, was caught on camera and sparked outrage throughout the climbing world. Mohammed worked for Layla Peak Expeditions, a Pakistani company specializing in Karakoram mountain tours. He wasn't a wealthy adventurer chasing dreams. He was working, earning money for his family, and K2 killed him anyway. To understand what happened, you need to understand the bottleneck. At 26,000 feet, you enter the death zone. Above this altitude, the air becomes too thin to sustain human life. Your lungs work overtime trying to extract oxygen from air that barely has any. Severe altitude sickness sets in. Without supplemental oxygen, you collapse from exhaustion. Your brain starts shutting down, your judgment fails, your body actively dies. K2's bottleneck sits at 26,400 feet, right in the heart of the death zone. It's characterized by a steep, narrow gully with massive ice glaciers hanging above it. Those glaciers can break loose at any moment, triggering avalanches and sending house-sized chunks of ice careening down the mountain. One wrong step, one piece of falling ice, and you're gone. On July 27, 2023, at roughly 2:30 a.m., a long line of climbers trudged through the bottleneck. They were in the final push to the summit. Many were trying to break records. If they didn't summit that day, they'd have to pack up and go home. The expedition window was closing. Mohammed Hassan's job that night was setting guide ropes, fixed lines that other climbers would clip into for safety. Dangerous work in the most dangerous place on Earth. And then, tragedy struck. An avalanche slammed into the mountainside. Snow engulfed climbers. Mohammed fell. When he hit the slope below, his oxygen mask shattered. In the death zone, where oxygen is the only thing keeping you alive. A climber named Ilya Saikali witnessed what happened next. They managed to pull him back up, At first he was alive, but he couldn't be saved. Then everyone had to step over him to continue toward the summit. Let me repeat that. Mohammed Hassan lay on the narrow path, begging for help, unable to move as hypothermia and oxygen deprivation set in, and over 50 climbers stepped over his dying body and kept climbing. Drone footage captured Mohammed still moving for 3 hours, 3 hours of hoping someone would help, but the help never came. Here's the brutal context. Before his accident, experienced Sherpas on the rope-fixing team told Mohammed to turn back multiple times. His equipment wasn't adequate, his clothing wasn't warm enough, but he refused and followed the other climbers up. Why? Because Layla Peak Expeditions paid him 250,000 Pakistani rupees, about $896, to sort himself out with equipment. He likely saved that money for his family instead of buying proper gear. He left behind 3 young children. Mohammed's death exposed an ugly truth about the mountaineering industry. Sherpas and porters risk their lives to enable wealthy clients to summit these mountains. But they're paid almost nothing. They can't afford the same quality equipment. And when things go wrong, they die while their clients keep climbing. Over 50 people passed Mohammed. Not one attempted a rescue. Not because they were cruel or heartless, but because at that altitude, in those conditions, helping someone often means dying alongside them. That's the mathematics of the death zone. Cold, brutal, unforgiving. The question haunts the climbing community. What would you have done? Before we continue with more stories from K2, I want to say something. This channel is dedicated to sharing the untold stories from the world's most dangerous mountains, stories of courage, tragedy, and the thin line between triumph and death. If you're finding value in this content, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me reach more people who appreciate these stories. Your support means everything. Now, let's continue. Next up, Jan Frederickson, a Swedish mountaineer and extreme skier who had conquered some of the world's most dangerous peaks. But sometimes experience isn't enough protection against the mountains. Eriksson grew up in northern Sweden, but spent much of his time in the French Alps. In 2003, he climbed and skied down Ismail Somoni Peak in Tajikistan, 24,590 feet of brutal terrain. In 2004, he became the first Swede to ski down from the summit of Shishapangma in Tibet, a 26,335-foot monster. Skiing down an 8,000-meter mountain requires nerves of steel and flawless technique. One mistake at those speeds, at that altitude, and you're dead. But Eriksson was obsessed with pushing boundaries. Skiing was his passion and his addiction. In 2005, he and Norwegian partner Jørgen Amat attempted to ski Lila Peak in Pakistan. Harsh conditions forced them to turn back just hundreds of feet from the summit, but they became the first people to ever ski down that mountain. Later that year, they successfully skied from the summit of Gasherbrum II, another 8,000-meter peak. Eriksson's adventures were featured in documentary films. He was becoming a legend in extreme skiing circles. But K2 called to him. The ultimate challenge, the mountain that even the best climbers feared. In 2009, something terrible foreshadowed his own death. Eriksson and his friend Michel Fay were attempting an extremely difficult first ski descent of K2. After spending a night at Camp 2, they began their descent. Everything seemed perfect. Then, at roughly 21,000 feet, Michel's skis slipped on a sheet of ice. He collided with rocks and was catapulted over the edge. Eriksson watched helplessly as his friend plummeted 3,280 feet to his death. Most people would have walked away, would have abandoned the dream after watching their partner die. But Eriksson couldn't let go. K2 consumed his thoughts. He had to ski down the savage mountain, had to complete what Michel couldn't. On the morning of August 6, 2010, Eriksson, his partner Ralf Duimovitz, and Austrian climber Gerlinde Kaltenbrunner set out from Camp 4. All week they'd dodged bowling ball-sized rocks dislodged by snowmelt. They slept in their helmets because rockfall was constant. But Eriksson was determined. They left camp at 1:30 a.m., light snow, 300-foot visibility, howling winds, bone-chilling temperatures of -5 degrees Fahrenheit. But weather forecasts predicted improvement, so they pushed forward. Between 6:30 and 7 a.m., just below the bottleneck, Ralph's frostbitten hands forced him to turn back. Eriksson and Kaltenbrunner continued upward. At the bottleneck, Eriksson stopped to place a metal spike driven into ice for support. And that's when another rock broke loose from the snowmelt above. It came screaming down the mountain, gathering speed. Eriksson saw it coming, but couldn't move fast enough. The rock hit him with devastating force, completely knocking him off the mountain. Kaltenbrunner watched in horror as Eriksson plummeted 1,000 meters to his death. In an instant, no time to react, no chance to save himself, just gone. She immediately turned back and descended to base camp. When she arrived and told her husband Ralph what had happened, all they could do was recount those final tragic moments. Eriksson had died at the start of K2's bottleneck, and when they eventually found his body, his skis were still strapped to his backpack. He never got his dream descent. Sometimes the mountain simply decides you don't get to leave. Tadeusz Potski learned this lesson the hard way. A Polish mountaineer who witnessed two of his climbing partners die but kept pushing forward until K2 claimed him too. Piotrowski's story began in the 1960s in Poland's Tatra Mountains. By the time he graduated university, his passion for mountaineering had ignited into an obsession. He became one of Poland's most celebrated climbers, renowned globally as a winter climbing specialist. A true pioneer who often attempted routes no one had ever climbed before. His resume was staggering. Winter climbs of Trollriggen in Norway, Noshak in Afghanistan, Tirikmir in Pakistan, Rakaposhi in Pakistan, Distagil Sar in Pakistan, Api in Nepal. He'd even successfully summited K2 during the summer of 1986. He knew the savage mountain intimately. But K2 doesn't care about experience or credentials. It takes whoever it wants. Piotrowski's first encounter with death came in 1974. He and his partner Stanisław Latawo were attempting to summit Lhotse, the fourth highest mountain on Earth. Stanisław was a cinematographer documenting the expedition. On December 17th, while descending from Camp 3, Stanisław suffered a fatal fall into a crevasse of the Khumbu icefall. He was only 29. His body was never recovered. Piotrowski's next brush with tragedy came in 1983 during a winter ascent of Cho Oyu. His climbing partner Andrei Chok summited with him, but they became separated during the descent. The exact details remain unclear, but Andrei became lost. He was never found, presumed dead somewhere near the summit. Two partners lost. Two devastating tragedies. But Piotrowski's pioneering nature wouldn't stop. And unfortunately, his own death came on July 10, 1986. 2 days earlier, Piotrowski and his partner Jerzy Kukuczka completed the first descent of K2's south face, a route so insanely dangerous it's known as the Polish Line. Reinhold Messner, the legendary Italian climber who first soloed Everest without oxygen, called this route suicidal. Vertical ice walls, constant avalanche danger, seracs, massive ice columns that can collapse without warning. Attempting this route was madness, but they did it. They made history. And then they had to descend. After 2 exhausting days with no food or water, the pair continued down the Abruzzi spur. According to reports, Piotrowski lost his crampons, metal spikes that attached to boots for gripping ice, essential equipment. Without them, walking on ice becomes nearly impossible. At around 25,900 feet, Piotrowski suddenly lost his footing. He slipped on the icy terrain and fell to his death. After everything he'd accomplished, after all the mountains he'd conquered, K2 took him because of lost crampons. And the tragedy continued. On October 24, 1989, his climbing partner that day, Kukuczka, also died. He was attempting the unclimbed south face of Lhotse when his rope failed. A second-hand rope he'd bought at a used equipment market. It snapped as he fell, and he plunged 6,560 feet. His body was never recovered. The mountains took them all eventually. Now, let me tell you about 3 climbers whose deaths are intertwined. Juan Pablo Moore, John Snorri Sigurjonsson, Ali Sadpura, 3 highly accomplished mountaineers who died together on K2 in February 2021. Juan Pablo Moore from Chile was a powerhouse. In 2017, he became one of the first Chileans to summit Annapurna, the 10th highest peak in the Himalayas at 26,545 feet. In 2019, he entered the Guinness Book of World Records for summiting Lhotse and Everest without returning to base camp in under a week without Sherpas or supplemental oxygen. An absolutely superhuman achievement, but Juan had a brush with death just weeks before his final climb. On January 17, 2021, he and fellow climber Sergei Mingot were descending K2 in winter without oxygen when Sergei suffered a catastrophic fall. He died shortly after. Juan witnessed his partner's death and kept climbing. Jan Snorri Sigurjonsson from Iceland was the first Icelander to summit K2, Lhotse, and Broad Peak, the 12th highest mountain in the world. In January 2021, he assisted with search and rescue operations for a missing Russian-American climber on Pasu Peak. This delayed his K2 plans. Isn't it strange how both John and Juan were in the presence of death just days before their own? Ali Sadpara from Pakistan was a legend. In 2016, he was part of the team that made the first winter ascent of Nanga Parbat. By the end of his career, he'd conquered 8 8,000-meter peaks, 4 of them in a single calendar year, an incredible feat of endurance and skill. In February 2021, Sadpara, his 21-year-old son Sajid, John, and Juan teamed up for a winter ascent of K2. Sajid had summited K2 in 2019, so he knew what they were facing. On the evening of February 4, 2021, the team left their highest camp for the final push. When they reached the bottleneck, Sajid's oxygen regulator malfunctioned, equipment failure that probably saved his life. He was forced to descend. Juan, Ali, and John continued upward. They never came back. On February 5th, the team was reported missing. 2 Pakistani Army helicopters launched search and rescue missions, but found nothing. No bodies, no signs, nothing. 5 months later, a Madison mountaineering Sherpa team fixing ropes above camp discovered the bodies. Juan had descended below the bottleneck and appeared to be waiting for the others, but they never arrived. John had become tangled in his own guide rope, likely not realizing it as he struggled down the mountain in deteriorating conditions. Ali's body was found nearby. These 3 experienced mountaineers, men who'd conquered some of Earth's highest peaks, all fell victim to K2's brutal winter. Extreme fatigue, hypothermia, oxygen deprivation. They simply couldn't move anymore and froze to death. Sajid Sadpara recovered all 3 bodies and gave them proper burials, a son laying his father to rest on the mountain that killed him. Extreme fatigue is a silent killer on these mountains. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly until suddenly you can't take another step. Dudley Wolfe learned this in 1939, and his exhaustion led to 4 deaths. Wolfe was an American socialite with more money than mountaineering experience. At a party he organized, he was approached by Fritz Wiesner, a German-American climber planning to attempt K2. None of the 14 8,000-meter peaks had been summited yet. This was a pioneering attempt at the seemingly impossible. Wiesner needed wealthy backers to fund the expedition. Wolfe was immediately hooked despite his lack of high-altitude experience. They gathered a team and set sail for the Savage Mountain in 1939. Once on the mountain, Wolfe was dismayed that Wiesner hadn't brought 2-way radios. Communication would be nearly impossible. But they pressed on. Wolfe started strong, but quickly drew criticism for being noticeably slower than the others. However, Wiesner favored him because he didn't complain and maintained his endurance. Wolfe eventually reached Camp 8 at 25,300 feet, higher than any other American climber. But he could go no farther. Wiesner and Pasang Dawa Lam, regarded as one of the greatest Sherpa mountaineers of the 20th century, decided to continue to the summit and return for Wolfe. Wolfe waited 7 days in the death zone for them to return. 7 days at 25,300 feet with limited supplies. The fact he survived that long is astounding. Wiesner and Pasang didn't reach the summit. When they returned to Wolfe and descended to Camp 7, they discovered a horrifying situation. All equipment had been removed from the lower camps by other team members who thought the summit attempt had been abandoned. No rescue was possible. They eventually reached base camp, but Wolf was still up there. He waited another 7 days in nightmarish conditions. On July 29th, 3 Sherpas attempted a rescue. They reached Wolf, but he was delirious from hypothermia. His mind was gone. He refused to descend and asked them to return the next day. 2 days later, the 3 Sherpas attempted another rescue. They never came back. K2 swallowed them during their ascent. They were never seen again. By this point, Wolf had spent 38 days above 22,000 feet and 16 days without supplemental oxygen. He died on approximately July 30th, 1939. It wasn't until 2002 that any trace of Dudley Wolf was found. Skeletal remains discovered on the Godwin-Austen Glacier at the base of K2. Along with vintage mountaineering equipment and a leather mitten marked Wolf, using an old dinner plate found with the remains, a plaque was made at the nearby Gilkey Memorial, which listed 52 other climbers who died on K2. 4 men dead because 1 man couldn't descend and 3 others tried to save him. But sometimes, disaster strikes multiple people at once in a cascading nightmare of bad decisions and worse luck. The 2008 K2 disaster killed 11 climbers and seriously injured 3 others in the worst catastrophe in K2's history. The best time to climb K2 is between June and August, but in July 2008, brutal weather prevented any summit attempts. As the end of July approached, 10 teams anxiously waited for conditions to improve. They were running out of time. Finally, on August 1st, the weather cleared. Teams from France, Ireland, South Korea, Nepal, Norway, Pakistan, and Serbia gathered at Camp 4 to begin their ascent. They agreed to cooperate, sharing resources, fixing ropes together, watching each other's backs. But complications began immediately. An experienced high-altitude porter named Shaheen Baig started suffering severe altitude sickness. He returned to camp, leaving the other porters and Sherpas disorganized. Without their most skilled member, crucial mistakes happened. Ropes were forgotten. Some were placed too low on the slope. The teams ran out of rope just above the death zone, right at the bottleneck. Delays stacked up. Climbers stood waiting in the most dangerous place on Earth. Then, the first death occurred. Serbian climber Dren Mandic attempted to pass Norwegian mountaineer Cecilia Skog. While adjusting his oxygen equipment, he detached from the fixed rope. He lost his balance, collided with Skog, and plummeted over 330 feet down the bottleneck. Skog remained clipped to the rope and survived. Mandic didn't. Some team members descended to recover Mandic's body. During this attempt, another porter named Umik Bote, already suffering from altitude sickness, fell and failed to self-arrest. He tumbled down the mountain to his death, 2 dead. But the other teams continued upward to the summit. Many climbers reached the summit. It was now 8:30 p.m. with darkness descending over K2. And then catastrophe struck. A massive serac, a wall of glacial ice, broke loose from above the bottleneck. It came roaring down the mountain like a frozen tsunami. The serac sliced through the fixed safety ropes, sweeping climber Rolf Bay off the mountain to his death. The avalanche that followed claimed 4 more lives. Climbers found themselves stranded in the death zone at 26,250 feet as darkness consumed them. With no ropes to clip into and no fall protection, they faced an impossible choice: attempt a free solo descent in the dark or build emergency shelters and wait for daylight. Panic spread through the group. Some risked the night descent, others stayed put. For many, descending proved fatal. In the darkness, more climbers lost their footing and fell to their deaths. Rescue attempts began in the early hours of August 2nd, but most of the damage was done. Many bodies were never recovered. When the full extent of the tragedy became clear, the death toll stood at 11 lives lost. The 2008 K2 disaster revealed how quickly things can spiral out of control on the savage mountain. 1 sick porter, some forgotten ropes, a collapsing serac, and suddenly 11 people are dead. K2 doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't give second chances. It takes what it wants and leaves bodies frozen on its slopes as warnings to everyone who comes after. These stories aren't meant to glorify death or sensationalize tragedy. They're meant to honor the people who push themselves to the absolute limit of human endurance, who dared to dream of standing on top of one of Earth's most dangerous peaks, who paid the ultimate price for that dream. Muhammad Hassan, working for $896 to support his family. Jan Frederickson, chasing the perfect ski descent. Tadeusz Potski, pioneering impossible routes. Juan, John, and Ali, attempting a winter ascent. Dudley Wolfe and the Sherpas, who died trying to save him. The 11 climbers of 2008 caught in a cascade of disasters. They all had families, dreams, reasons for being on that mountain, and K2 took them all.